Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of American Scousers TV's Fantasy Premier League show. We are back after a couple-week hiatus between the international break and, well, what we like to call little technical difficulties that we ran into last Thursday night while I was away. Uh, my co-host is with us today with his fantasy background all updated. Have we figured out what was happening and why the Gremlins would not allow the show to start last Thursday?
So anytime I was running multiple programs, and by multiple programs, I mean just the browser had multiple tabs, the computer would go and just shut down. And so I restarted it several times, and it was having the same problem. So I left it for a few days, and then by Saturday morning, it it was one of those weird things where it just magically was working again all of a sudden. So I'm pretty sure at some point in the near future, I'm going to have the same issue. I think last year I had an issue like that where it just kept disconnecting while we were in a show, just the two of us, and it kept disconnecting, reconnecting, disconnect, reconnecting. So I think the world just doesn't need to know what I had to say last week, and that's a good sign. I mean, that's pretty much all I needed to hear from the universe.
So, speaking of reconnecting, connecting, and or restarting, if you are interested, you are able to still join our league. The code is on the screen. Feel free to go ahead into the Fantasy Premier League app, go to join a league, public league, and go ahead and type in the code you see on the screen. It'll take you right in, and who knows, maybe we will have you on one of these top 10 slides moving forward. So, Cade Nicholson is our current leader as the unused substitute. Pretty good team name. Not the biggest of weeks overall, but a really good score, 333 points after 5 match weeks. I believe it's somewhere in top 35,000, somewhere right around there, if I'm not mistaken. But a really good overall performance there. Wrapping up down to our top 10 with 318 points. So, bit of a discrepancy between the two of them. Lots of green arrows on the screen, though, so you can tell that there's a lot of changes at the top of the table. Do you have any intention of trying to get yourself anywhere near this anytime soon?
I mean, I think the intention is always to get there, but the reality is that just not good enough to get there. So yeah, that's where I'm living.
So the points that are getting up there and how people are getting to those points, obviously, comes from starting the right sides each week. So I thought we would take a look here at the kind of the team of the week from the last match week, because I found it kind of interesting. Like, this was one of those weeks where you really had to have the secondary players right, because I don't know that outside of Julian Alvarez and maybe a little Botman, that many of the players that are on the screen right now are owned by too many of the top half of this game. Any players here from the last player of the week, or any of these guys that have either been in your mind, guys that you've thought about bringing in, whether it be Hammer or even Trossard, based on Arsenal's current fitness issues, especially with Martinelli's injury?
I think the only one that I would considered before Martinelli's injury was Alvarez, and I think we talked about having that Alvarez and Holland duo up top, and it was, it can be really fruitful. And the problem is, though, that that's just a lot to invest in one team attacking, especially from a team that has a lot of goal threat outside of just Holland and Alvarez, because you've got the likes of Bernardo Silva and Jack Grealish, and even Kovacic sometimes that pop up in those spots, and Phil Foden, and so it's difficult to invest too much money long term in just those two guys. But now with Martinelli's injury, Trossard becomes a bit more interesting, because Saka overall has not been great for fantasy this year. I know Arsenal's been playing has been decent, right? But they're not quite up to the level they were playing last year, and Saka is not quite at the level where he was last year at this time, especially fantasy wise. So there is some money to save there if you're thinking about bringing on someone like Trossard, who will take up Martinelli's minutes and who is much cheaper than Saka, and who can, I think, point for money make a little bit more sense overall for your team.
Did you happen to see Hudson-Odoi's goal
Against in this past match week?
Yeah. So I found that like almost comical as he scores this like match tying goal. Saves a point for his new club. Really, really quality, play by him. Great strike. And you just think to yourself, Chelsea can't score. And they literally had this guy like, I think Chelsea, I know a bunch of Chelsea fans who all say the same thing. Like they don't understand like how the club treated this guy because he has all the talent in the world. They played him out of position. He'd have like a bad 10-minute cameo appearance, and then he wouldn't get a sniff of the field for like 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And, he's been on the fringes of the first team. He goes to Forest, and he could be an interesting play as the season goes on because if he earns himself a regular starting spot at 4.9 million as a midfielder who can score and create, that offers a lot of flexibility depending on how you want to build out your team. Speaking of how guys are building out their team, but before we get to that, we like to remind everyone that we are doing a giveaway again through the end of the month. So you got just over 9 more days to go over to our American Scouser TV at American Scouser page on YouTube and subscribe to the channel. All subscribers who subscribe during this month will be entered into a raffle for an opportunity to win a home 23-24 Liverpool jersey. So go ahead, get over there to the page, and please give the page a subscription. At the same time, if you have comments or would like to get involved with the show, please go ahead and do so. So let's take a look at those teams and the guys coming in. No surprise for me that Julian Alvarez is at the top of this list. He's probably the most informed striker in the Premier League. I'd say he's the most informed striker in the world, but all Jude Bellingham does is score match-winning goals. So Julian Alvarez, Sven Botman for Newcastle, Brian Mbeumo, James Ward-Prowse, and Liverpool's own Mo Salah wrap out the top 5 players bought this week. Not a big surprise for me for Alvarez. How about you when it comes to Botman and Mbeumo? Any of these jump out at you? Any of these you think might be a stretch?
Not necessarily. I feel pretty good about all of them. I think because if we're looking at the numbers of transfers in, typically when we're looking at the top 5, like you'll see several that are above 300,000-400,000. Like there seems to be a pattern of consistency of who gets brought in. I think this was one of those weeks where whether people were on their wild card or using a free hit, because I've seen some of that, is that it's sort of just taking what they've seen the first 5 weeks and rebuilding their team based off that. And I think there are 6, 7, 8 players that are within that range. It just happens that Botman and Mbeumo and Ward-Prowse are going to be sort of the more on the cheaper end, so they fill out your team a little bit easier than the likes of Mo. I know with Mo, despite his price, he's been one of the most consistent returns this year, at least. Especially, given if unfortunately he didn't have that third assist against Wolves, but if that didn't take a deflection, then Mo gets 3 assists and he gets even more. He gets 4 more points. So not surprised by any of that. I think as time goes on, I don't expect most of those guys to be in a team in maybe by January. I think I pretty much feel like Alvarez is going to be a mainstay in most teams, but then the rest are going to be rotated in and out.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there. I'm not sure. I mean, I think Botman just offers so much value at the price, and their fixtures have taken a really good turn. So I think you'll see a lot more purchasing of Newcastle assets over the next few weeks, especially on the defensive side, so you have an idea of how they're going to play overall. I think another big piece of what I'm seeing here is the James Ward-Prowse one is interesting. He is really starting to come alive at West Ham and from a fantasy standpoint, We know what he does over a set piece. We know how he operates from the corner kick and the type of dead ball delivery he has. And we know how they play. So I think, he's tailor-made for fantasy points at West Ham. And I think it was just a matter of time before he started to add to it. And again, another guy who's fairly priced for his overall ability and output. So we look at the players that come in. Let's take a look at the players that have gone out. Headlined by a couple Chelsea players in Nick Jackson and Ben Chilwell. The surprise sitting of Alexander Isak last week, I think, jumped out at people. And then, of course, Wilson doing what Wilson does, which is just score when he plays and is fit. I think is leading some folks to think that maybe Eddie Howe's tipping his hand of which players will play in the Champions League and which players will be more focused for the league. Sully March, and of course the enigma that is Marcus Rashford. Of the players going out, I know a couple of those surprised me, not as much that they're going out, but the why they're going out. What about you? Where do you land on the players going out?
Yeah, I think the Jackson one is probably the easiest for me, given his price and seeing how rough of a stretch he's had at the beginning, and the inability of him to finish has really, I feel like, has soured a lot of fantasy owners. And even if he does come back with a goal or an assist within the next 2 games, it's still going to be one of those things where you just expect him not to be able to hit the frame from 7-8 yards out, when he should be hitting the goal every time for the amount of money that he was brought in for his position. I mean, that is his job, is just to put it on goal. And if he's not capable of doing that, then it makes sense why he's moving. Chilwell, he's not going to be progressing as much as he was the first 2 weeks. Like, we thought he was pretty much playing as a winger the first couple weeks, and since then he's not playing up front as much as he was. And so if Chelsea's going to be leaking goals and he's not getting up as much on the pitch at his price, it makes sense, if you still want a Chelsea asset, to go down to like a Malo Gusto and save $1.5 million and then take that elsewhere. The rest, I mean, Isak, like you said, a lot of rotation problems there. And do you want to spend plus, $7 or more million on rotation issues? It's been a difficult time to figure out exactly who is going to play when. And if you're going to have those question marks every week, it's just easier not have a question mark if you take him out of your team. Where do
you land on the Rashford situation? United is a tough investment right now. They actually have a decent run of fixtures coming. They have a good fixture on paper in Burnley on the road this weekend, but the way Anana's playing in net, the way, guys are struggling, Rashford's off form. I guess, Højlund did score in the midweek during the Champions League, so maybe that gets him going. But where do you stand on United and investment in their assets?
I'm looking away from them. I haven't had a United asset all year, I believe. I know I flirted with the idea of, I had Bruno to begin the year, but I went off of him pretty quickly once Son started coming back to being Heung-Min Son again. And I think right now it's really difficult to see what to expect from United. It's a pretty tumultuous time at that club. And I feel like we've said that for a couple of years, but at least there's been some fantasy relevance. Now we're sort of in this weird flux where you don't really know where to invest your money if you are picking someone to choose from United. Like, do you want to pick their best goal scorer right now is Casemiro? And it's like, how are you going to justify spending that money on essentially a CDM as your main goal scoring threat if when you can save that money and use it elsewhere in your team? So I'm staying clear of all United assets right now until we really see them turn it around. I don't think there's going to be much for me to jump on. I think Højlund might be an interesting one. If you don't want to have the Haaland Alvarez stack, I think that's something to look into. But for the time being, I'm just staying clear, honestly.
Yeah, I'm not really touching them either. I think, honestly, when I wildcarded last week, I thought about bringing in Reguilón only because he's going to get a run of 5 or 6 starts, and he's 4.4 million. You saw what he did at Spurs at times. He shows an attacking ability from the fullback position. But then I started thinking about it, and it just didn't make sense to even invest that extra 0.4 million. I figured I could go to a $4 million defender because I couldn't see him playing, and I couldn't see me playing him and feeling comfortable about it. Sully March is another interesting one. Him and Isak, I think, was more European football rotation. Both got the starts. One in the Brighton in the Europa League this afternoon, and of course Isak in the Champions League earlier in the week at Milan. I am going to stick with Chilwell for at least one more week. We'll talk about our teams later. Pochettino made some interesting comments. He also ripped Mudryk after the match. So talking about how he has to improve and get stronger and more physically fit if he's going to compete at this level in the Premier League. So I can almost see him going back to Chilwell. There was also some rumblings that he might have had a knock, and they didn't really want that to get out in the media because he's had so many trouble with injuries over the past. I just struggle with the idea that he's not still a locked-in starter at Chelsea with all the problems they have, and he offers such a consistency and a veteran presence. I would think that's what Pochettino wanted to build around, but it'll be interesting to see where he goes. So when it comes to you and you are building your teams and you're thinking about where you want to go, how much of it do you take into account European football, league football, who's going off on international football? Like, we take a lot of flack when we talk about this game in our inner circles at American Scouser for the lineup predictor game and all the different, jokes that we get about really the game is luck because it's really about picking lineups. And I'm always the one who's like, unless, of course, the people that are good at it are the ones that are the best at the game. So it's kind of like a skill to the game is identifying which players will play and which matchups are best. How much do you weigh European football? And is this a time where maybe assets at a club like Chelsea or Spurs are maybe valued a little higher because there isn't any European football for them to have to deal with in between the EPL matches?
Yeah, I think there's a point to that. I think part of it, I do look at fixtures and seeing how many players played what kind of minutes. Like we saw at Arsenal, we had the main guys play 70, 80 minutes. City, you had Haaland play all 90. And so I think there is a little bit of responsibility that you should put on yourself to make sure that you are paying attention to that, especially if the club has history of rotation. The problem is we haven't really seen the likes of Brighton in Europe, the likes of Arsenal in Europe, the likes of Newcastle in Europe, the likes of Villa in Europe for the past several years. So we don't quite know how these teams are going to respond to that schedule. And I think so for me right now, given some of the mainstays like Liverpool and City and United that we've seen have their European fixtures, you kind of have a good sense of what to expect when it comes to, especially depending on the manager. Like we know Mo is going to get 90 most times just because it's Mo, right? But then if we look at somewhere like Brighton where they're finally in Europe and we're not sure how De Zerbi's going to respond to that in that balance, then how I'm looking at it is I'm sort of just taking a gamble on what I think is the strongest lineup that he can put out for the weekend. Because while they are still in Europe, if Europe doesn't go well, you still have to do well in the Premier League. So it's not like they have to completely throw away any chance of winning during the weekend. So while I am paying attention to Europe, and I think it's important to pay attention to Europe, I think it's also important to realize that we're not sure to what extent Europe is going to change how it's going to change these teams that have just qualified for the first time in a while, at least.
So brought a few different players up here. We can talk about other players as well, but stick or twist, or we keep buying or selling. And, we talked about Chilwell a little bit. I mentioned I'm going to stick around with him for at least one more week. Have some faith. They have a good run of fixtures. It's hard to get off an asset that can score on both ends of the pitch. And I know they're leaking goals, but man, they play some bad teams coming up. So I feel like Chelsea has an opportunity to rack up some points. Obviously, where are you with Estupiñán? He was in your side, right? Is he still in your side at this point?
He's still there. Yeah, I feel comfortable enough with my bench where if I do start him like last week, I had Botman come in for him and get the 9 points, which was really nice. I think I'm at a point where I can keep a Estupinian for another week and sort of see how that dust settles there, and then decide where to go from there. But for the time being, he's still in the team.
We touched on Isak, but what is your take on Isak, both as a player, as a fantasy asset? Do you think, maybe Eddie Howe and Newcastle as an entire side just haven't totally adapted to his game enough? Because he was such a force at times last year, and it feels like he's almost regressed this season in his overall, not as much his play, but his actual like overall importance on the side.
Yeah, he's had a few moments this year, but nothing like it was last year. Like that crazy 50-yard run from the half line down the sideline and then weaving around Everton defenders like that. We haven't seen that kind of Isak, but I think he's an incredibly skillful player. But I think right now Newcastle is in this weird flux of going off of that high of last year and that success to now trying to adapt to maybe a slightly different style of play to make it more consistent throughout the year, because maybe Howe sees the likes of Klopp sides that just went pedal to the metal and pretty much just wore out their guys within a couple of years. Maybe he's looking at it going, I don't know if we can necessarily do that, because I don't know if in a few years we're going to burn out all these guys and we'll be kind of back to square one. And so he's kind of changing the style a little bit, not letting the players play like they did last year. That's a weird one for me. I've been off of Isak. I've been off of all Newcastle attacking. If anything, I still think they're a good defensive unit to have, but attacking offensively, it doesn't feel like they have what they had last year at the moment.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I think that's kind of a really kind of easy way to put it. I think they've regressed a little bit going forward. They shipped a few more goals. I do think their defense is about to go on a run. So I would really like to have assets like Botman, Trippier, Nick Pope. I just need to see them show that they have some kind of life, and at times it's been flashes, whether it was Harvey Barnes for a half, whether it was Isak at times. Wilson has scored some goals, but they even feel like kind of garbage points. And then lastly, partially just because it was fun to put the picture on the page, I remember at the beginning of the year, there was a lot of talk that Onana was literally like a set it and forget it $5 million keeper. United had fixtures galore for the first 10 to 15 match weeks, and why would anyone even consider how to handle a keeper? And I think someone shared in one of our Discords a stat that came out in the middle of the Bayern game that Onana's first 12 shots on target as a United keeper, 9 found the back of the net. That's amazing.
It's crazy.
If you're a Man United supporter, after you take a shower and forgive yourself for your sins, do you really start to question whether this is like a colossal mistake? Because there were a lot of people at Inter who thought it was an awful lot of money that they got, and they almost fleeced us. And if you Google Andre Onana blooper or Andre Onana mistakes, you will literally see about a 10 to 15 minute roll of everything from Barcelona Academy videos to Ajax videos to some Inter videos. And now, right down to literally him sitting down on a breakaway or just not being able to get his body. I mean, that mistake against Bayern is I hate to say it, and the poor guy had a concussion. It's right up there with Karius in the final of the Champions League. I mean, he just looked like he lost flight of the ball, and just had no clue what was going on. It really changed everything. Forget fantasy for a second. Where does United go from here when it comes to their goalkeeping situation?
It's tough because I know Timothy and I many months ago on the morning show when the news came through that Onana was going to United, it made sense because Ten Hag wanted a keeper that is able to play out from the back with his feet. And clearly De Gea wasn't of that caliber, and that's fine. But I think what De Gea lacked with his feet, he made up with his hands, right? I mean, he had moments where he was the best keeper in the world. And there were times where it felt like, yeah, he was prone to a mistake, but overall, you didn't have to worry about him making a big mistake. You didn't have to worry about it consistently. Now, I feel like with Onana, and welcome back, Gally, while he does play really well with his feet, is it worth it if he can't get the ball to his feet because it's in the back of his net? And that's the problem, is that at what point do you look at it and go, how much do you want to give but then have to take, right? There's always got to be some sort of trade-off. It's like how good do you want him to be with his feet, but also how good do you want him to protect the net? Do you want him to protect better with the net, but then he can't play as well with his feet, so you have to kind of change your style of play? So I don't think United's going to change anything about their goalkeeping situation right now, because they spent a lot of money to bring this guy in. This was who Ten Hag wanted, and I think they'll give him more of a chance to make it work. But come January, if these rumblings and it's more consistent like this, I mean, we're going to be looking at a new keeper, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting one there. I think he will stick with him for a while. And I think he has plenty of rope because the backup was, the guy who came from Fenerbahce. It's not like he's an established keeper in the Premier League. It's not like it's Arsenal and you have David Raya sitting behind Ramsdale waiting to come in and take his job, which is probably about to happen in the next few weeks. Again, another manager who just wants to upgrade to a keeper who can play better from his feet, playing out from the back than the one that he has, who might be a better shot stopper, which is interesting. Let's get into your team a little bit. Take a look here. So before we move on to what your plans are for this week, talk to me about last week. Obviously, you had the lucky break that your bench had a 9-point guy on it. He comes in, kind of saves your week overall, keeps you above the safety line. Did you make moves into this? Like, had you made transfers last week? What was the kind of the before and afters that led to this outcome?
Yeah. So I had Bruno and Gabriel, and I took Bruno down to Son, and I took Gabriel down to Anderson, sort of as just having more a bench fodder who will play most likely 80 to 90. I know it's not for a great team, but it's better than having, someone who's not going to play at all. So, and it was something that made the squad fit. And I felt like going forward, and like we have seen in the beginning, there's going to be a lot of 3-5-2. So I don't necessarily need to worry about having more defenders if I feel pretty good about at least 3 out of the 4 that I think will start. And so I'm comfortable with that rotation. And so that was my big thing. Unfortunately with Son, and there's a little graphic that I wish I sent over, because I scrolled through, I saw it and I was going to screenshot it, but I missed it. There's the curse of the highest transferred in player. Every week so far in this year, the highest transferred in player the week after scores either 1 or 2 points only. So they'll either just have a full 90 without a return, or they'll have a yellow card, or they'll only make like a 20-minute appearance. And so Son fell victim to that. And so I'm expecting Alvarez to pretty much take a dump this weekend on all the owners that brought him in, hopefully. But yeah, those are my 2 moves. Obviously, like you said, the Botman thing worked out, and João Pedro scoring again was nice. Other than that, it was a pretty low scoring week overall for the entire community. 46 as the average is pretty damn low when we're used to seeing the averages in the 60s and 70s. So I think overall I got kind of lucky that I got 53, and I'm closing in on the top million. Actually, I am in the top million. Excuse me. Yes,
no, you were in the top. You were in the top million for the week. Right?
No, top million overall.
Oh yeah, you are. You're 970,000 overall. You're right.
Finally broke it again. So that was the first step. Now it's 750K is the next goal.
There you go. You're only 40 points off the top 100,000. That's not that bad. 8 points off the top 500,000. So you could have had, one more big return, and you could have seen yourself find yourself into that top 100,000 or top 500,000 before you know it. What about this week? What's the plans?
So plans for this week, I feel pretty good about saving another transfer. This is a really weird year for me. Usually I find it very difficult to not do a transfer, but this will be the second time this year already where I'm going to hold my transfer and then set myself up for 2 transfers next week, just because I feel like I really like the fixtures this week, and there isn't any move that I make seems really lateral. And the moves I want to make would be a bigger upgrade and a smaller or a bigger upgrade somewhere, rather than just going from a 7-8 guy to a 7-6 guy. I want to make a more significant move. So until next week, I'm going to leave it as is and hope that Arsenal and Spurs ends up like 5-4, and Son and Saka will be responsible for at least half of those goals.
Yeah, I was going to say, you do have a little bit of that mixed one there, because are you going to start Udogie, or are you going to start Votman against, was it Sheffield or Luton or whatever weak team that Newcastle's playing?
Yeah, I'm actually sitting Chilwell, which is really weird now that I'm looking at it. I might change that, but yeah, Botman's away at Sheffield and Estupiñán's home against Bournemouth. So I really like those two fixtures a lot, especially if Estupiñán plays. And I don't know about Chilwell right now, so that might change. I might swing Chilwell in there, but I don't see anyone else I would take out, because I'd leave all 5 midfielders in there, and I would keep João Pedro in there just because they're home at Bournemouth. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at.
Little fear with João Pedro's minutes, just because he started today and played the full 90 on a Thursday in the first Europa League match. That might make me a little bit nervous. Obviously, Osula's not playing as much now since the signing of Archer and a few of their other players getting back healthy. I'm assuming you're going to slide Pickford in for Turner and not start Turner against City.
that's I'm gonna flip a coin on that one, but I'm gonna make sure it's a double head, like it's a one-sided coin essentially. So I know exactly which keeper is going. Yeah, it's Pickford.
It's funny in some ways you consider it though. Like, I don't know what the odds are that Everton will actually keep a clean sheet. So in a lot of ways, you might have a better chance of Pickford having 6 or 7 saves. I mean, Turner having 6-7 saves against City and having to pass the ball out a bunch and probably finding himself maybe into bonus points. You never know.
That's true.
Like your side overall, any deep-rooted concerns you have as you think about like when you're going to wild card? Like, how far do you allow Eze to just keep toiling on your team on promise alone?
He's scoring a hat trick this week, Gally. I don't know what you're talking about.
I mean, that would be something, seeing that he hasn't done anything except for pick up yellow cards, it feels like, all season long, and kind of ruin teams' ranks.
He had an 8 against Wolves the other week, so at least there's been one redeemable week so far. I'm going to be looking into wildcarding post the next international break. I think is where I'm thinking of shooting the wild card, and so until then, the only one I'm really worried about, and I mentioned earlier, is Saka, because I don't know. It just doesn't feel like I think he's still playing well. It just doesn't. It's not translating to fantasy well, and that's sometimes how the game works. You can have a player that's playing really well. It just doesn't translate into the game, and that might be one of those points now where I feel like maybe I'm spending too much there and can get a little bit more value elsewhere. But we'll see.
As soon as you jump off him, he'll go on a run.
Oh yeah,
he's one of those players. He's hard. His ownership is so high. You almost don't want to pass up on him for the pure fact of what could happen if you do. So I too had a 53 last week, and also sit here looking at a team that I'm pretty comfortable with. I had wild carded into this side. I toyed with whether I would start Shar or Cash right up to the last moment, which was pretty much a big frustration on my part, picking the wrong player. And then, of course, I thought maybe I'd sneak it by with Chilwell, and then they sub him on just for him to pick up a yellow card. I got to the point last week where I was working on my team. I had the one free transfer. Maybe I might have even had 2. I'm trying to make moves, and I really needed like 4 or 5 different moves to get to a place of really feeling comfortable about where the side was 4, 5 or 6 weeks out. And I just looked at things and thought to myself, you know what? This is an opportunity to hit reset. I'm okay with where the team is. I'm okay with dealing with this team 4 weeks to come. So really for me, it was kind of a no-brainer. Son, Sterling, Saka, all pretty much easy midfield choices if you're not going to go Mo, in my opinion. They're up there or abouts. There's other players you could slot in around the price points, whether it be Madison or even a Martinelli. Luckily, I didn't go that route. Foden's still there, questionable as for how long, but the Bernardo Silva injury makes me a little bit more comfortable with Grealish still not being back. So I did go the Holland Alvarez. Obviously, it paid off. I personally think if you were asking me right now, I think Alvarez is probably the Premier League's player of the year through the first 5 matches, both fantasy output and how he's playing. I went with the Newcastle double up, and I went with the 2 ones that offer the most offensive attacking prowess. They both got a clean sheet. I will be playing them this week, obviously, most likely with cash on the bench. I feel pretty good about it like you. I don't feel like I need to make a transfer this week. Obviously, I have Morris from Luton, so I can play him next week when he has the double match week. And, Luton actually has some pretty decent fixtures coming up, a couple home fixtures. I think he'll probably get 2 of the next 5 starts, and then eventually I'll probably downgrade him to Archer and save $1 million, just keep a fodder. What I like about this side is every one of these players almost is guaranteed to play 90 minutes, maybe outside of Chilwell every week. By not making a transfer this week, it gives me another week to watch Son, another week to look into where I'm at, and then make a decision next week with 2 free transfers on whether I want a little reconstruction by maybe downgrading Chilwell, maybe even upgrading to a Robertson, who knows, and downgrading a player in the midfield. I really like the Diaby pick. I think that he's a differential that offers opportunity to pick up points for now. And that's really where I'm at with it. Ultimately, I need Sterling to fire. That's another one that from an ownership standpoint, I really have going in my favor. So, I wasn't ready to just hit the wild card and go like 5 differentials and just go for it. I think it's too early in the season for that. It's still volatile, went up 800,000 places last week. So I think ultimately at this point, just got to keep grinding, chipping away, moving up in the overall standings and getting to where we can and seeing where the chips lie.
Let me ask, what are your captaincy thoughts for this week? Is it still just as simple as put that armband on Holland, or are you thinking of going elsewhere?
I think about going elsewhere all the time. Kelly had 2 big weeks in a row making runs and moves up the leaderboards. And, she decided that when we were on vacation last week, she was going to captain Son and root for the triple, root for the hat trick and just make a big move on everyone. And it really backfired on her when Holland got the late goal and actually got his return for how far people jumped. So, I think there are some options out there, but I don't know that there's anything that I'm so confident in that I would pull that trigger and make that move. What about you? Are you thinking about taking the captaincy off of Holland this week? Like, are you thinking about going either Son? I mean, where would you go on your side if you were taking the captaincy off of Holland?
My armband right now is currently on a magnificent Mo Salah. Bringing it back a few years. Let's do it.
I like the move. I just, West Ham isn't a side that chips goals. And it is on the road. It's at home.
Yeah.
Oh, it is at home. Then that gives you a little bit more there. He didn't start today. He looked brilliant when he came on the pitch. That would be a big one, to have it on him and have him actually score a goal from open play would be, something of a feat in itself. I just get nervous that Liverpool has so many attacking options at this point.
Yeah.
And it's not like it was before where it felt like there was a funnel to his side of the pitch. It does feel like he is becoming more creator, but I like the shout. I'm
just worried about Holland's minutes this weekend. I don't think Forest at home is a fixture where coming off of 90 in the Champions League, Haaland might not be guaranteed more than 60 minutes. I understand he could score 3 in 60, but I think if there's any fixture in this early part of the year so far where I feel not as confident that he'll play as much and impact as much, it would be this one compared to what Mo will have against West Ham.
And that's very fair. I always get worried too. And then I remember that every time I questioned how many minutes Haaland would play, he'd play 90 minutes and score 2 in stoppage time.
Yeah.
I feel like Pep has rotation issues, except for when it comes to Haaland, because he looks at him almost like he's Superman. And now I say that he'll probably sit him in the next match. But that's kind of why I have Alvarez and Foden. It's almost like the cover for it as well. I do think Foden will probably be the player that I move out and use some funds to maybe upgrade. Like I could go Foden down to Mbeumo and then use that to take Chilwell to Robertson, something along those lines. We'll see where I go with the fullbacks and with the overall side. I'm really happy with the Leno Areola keeper partnership. They rotate pretty well over the next 6 to 8 match weeks with home matches and good fixtures. You know, Leno's been a really underrated fantasy asset for the last year and a half, playing really well for Fulham. And I'm feeling good about the Newcastle double up because I think they're just coming into their own. I think you almost saw that in the Champions League with them going to Milan and being able to hold out at the San Siro and keep a clean sheet, even though they were hit pretty hard with the Milan attack. So it'll be interesting to me to see where the teams go and what's next. Any parting shots, ideas for our listeners, things traps you're trying to avoid as we head into match week 6, 7, and 8 in the coming weeks in the fantasy world?
Yeah, take a look right now, especially as players are coming off of Europe for rotation, right? We talked about it earlier. Kind of pay attention to see if there are any patterns that you come across. The first 2-3 weeks of group play, I know sometimes can be a little difficult to gauge from because depending on who they're playing in the group versus who they're playing on the weekend, that might matter. But getting a nice consistent pattern of understanding of how the managers will be rotating, I think is key to pay attention to. But also at the end of the day, just don't forget that the Premier League is still an important league, and the managers are still going to try and win as much as they can in the league, even if they do have a European fixture 3 days before.
Yeah, I think the rotation watch minutes, patterns of players who are playing with other players and how they play together, I think is important. If you know that they're going to be resting a player that creates, then maybe that striker on, say, a lower level side isn't as good of a player. If they don't have the person behind them pulling the strings that really makes that offense go. And there are a few of those lower sides that really have 1-2 players they rely on to make most of the offense work. And they run through that player. So I think those are interesting ones. I think the other big thing now is I think we're hitting that point of the season where things are moving past just week to week trends. Now we're getting into patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a player that's getting subbed off at the 45th, 50th minute mark every week, if you have players like Nketiah that are just scoring goals, creating assists, and not being able to secure consistent starts, I think now you have to start to look at that as saying, maybe it isn't. I have to make a decision whether or not I'm okay with João Pedro being a 1-pointer and occasionally giving me 2 goals when he starts or even from the bench, or am I going to go, make a move to a guaranteed starter at 6 million or downgrade to a 5 million from a Luton or a Burnley. So I think you have to see those patterns of play. There's a big run of 8 matches that come up now through the Thanksgiving periods. They're always very important, in my opinion, in fantasy. This is where there's a lot of points made and dropped. And then we get into the busy holiday fixture season. So it's going to be exciting. It's going to be fun. I reminded you all about the giveaway earlier, but I'll remind you again, please go to the YouTube channel, American Scouser. Find our page. You'll see all of our mugs and all of our shows plastered all over it. Give the page a subscription. Drop us a comment. And more importantly, enter yourself for a chance to win a brand new Liverpool home jersey for this season. So we're excited to be able to give those away. Excited to have another episode in the books. For myself and Matoush, we will be back 1 week from now to talk about match week 6 and, of course, preview you all on your fantasy news for match week 7. So I hope your transfers work, all of you, Hall, and, well, I hope my co-host doesn't score as many points as me. All right, everyone, have a great week, and we will be back next Thursday night at 9 o'clock Eastern. All right.